Hey, good evening, everybody. I am Marc Lamont Hill, owner of Uncle Bobbie's Coffee and Books, and the host of tonight's event. As you know, Uncle Bobbie's prides itself on having the best writers, the best authors, the best thinkers, the most noted contributors to our intellectual and political culture in our store. And since we've been virtual during this global pandemic, we haven't stopped. We've gone to the online platform to have these amazing conversations. And I'm so excited to be part of tonight's amazing conversation with Derecka Purnell. Becoming Abolitionists is a book that I have been waiting for. It is a book that I am excited about. It's a book that I was excited to read and reread again yesterday. And I can't tell you how important a contribution it is to the work that many of us are doing on the ground, in classrooms, in the protest space, in the policy space. She is a freedom fighter. She is a brilliant writer. She's a thinker. She's an organizer. She's someone who loves Black people and loves freedom. And for me, that's the best kind of person. So I am excited to welcome you all here, but more importantly, Derecka, welcome to this conversation here at Uncle Bobbie's Coffee and Books.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. I had such a good time the other night and it was so brief. And so I'm happy that we have more time to be in conversation. I've been learning from you since way back I was in college. And so I just can't believe this is a big full circle moment for me. So thank you for having me. Really, truly. Thank you.
No, it's a pleasure. I mean, I said the same thing. And Derecka was on my show, Black News Tonight. And TV, you get 5 minutes to talk about abolition or anything, right? I mean, imagine that. And so tonight we have some time. We're going to have a conversation. We're going to talk about the book. We're going to talk about some of the big ideas in the book. I'm going to ask some of my writerly questions, and then we're going to go to the audience for more questions and more conversation. So I am looking forward to that. Let me start by talking about, or asking you to talk about, the tradition you come out of. As someone who thinks about abolition, I have been struck by just how central the work of Black women has been. When we talk about police abolition, we talk about prison abolition, we talk about critiquing or even naming the criminal prison industrial complex. When you think about the traditions that shape you, both as a writer of this book, but also as a person in the world who does the work that you do, what traditions produced you? What authors, what voices, what people made you are?
I'm gonna feel so bad if I leave somebody out, but know that it is my head and not my heart, as many people say in my family. Yeah, so many people. One thing that you will notice in the book is I'm constantly talking about other Black feminist scholars who made me possible. Like, really, I don't know if they own me, but I surely claim them. Right. So the book starts off with Angela Davis. Yes. And how when I was a little girl, my mom would talk about Black Panthers and her being incarcerated. And I didn't know her to have abolitionist politics. Right? My primary association with Angela Davis, especially as a kid, was through, her work alongside the Black Panther Party. And so when I got the chance to introduce her in college, that was my first introduction to Angela Davis, a scholar, a thinker, a theorist, right? And a political prisoner through the Free Angela movement. So that, absolutely Angela Davis, Our Prisons Obsolete and Abolition Democracy, among all of her other works around feminism and class, right? Her affiliation with the Communist Party while she was like in her early 20s, right? Trying to figure out how to fight back on capitalism. So I would hope that I'm in the same traditions that produced Angela Davis. Ruth Wilson Gilmore is someone else who when I think of a geographer, I didn't before think of like Ruth Wilson Gilmore. Then I met Ruth Wilson Gilmore and I read her work. And I was like, wow, this is someone who can think critically about space and time and how we create race and what race relationship is to capitalism. And then how do we dismantle that? So her work as an organizer, as a geographer, as a critical thinker, as an Aries, literally all of the above, all of the categories. Mariame Kaba is someone who I also hope to be in their tradition. I learned about Mariame Kaba, like lots of people learned about Mariame Kaba through Twitter, actually. And so I had was seeing prison culture for years and like reading, these tweets, these analysis, pushback, and then learning about her organizing in Chicago, learning about her own journey in becoming the abolitionist, figuring out, who were her mentees, who were what organization she found to get reparations, to fight against carceral systems. So those are just three people. Then you have Rachel Herzing, right, one of the early members of Critical Resistance, who more than anyone shaped my analysis around policing specifically, right? Not just prisons, because I had this disjointed idea of like prison abolition and police abolition, but Rachel Herzing also is just someone who I still turn to when I'm curious about so much, and I hopefully get to also be in the tradition that made her possible as well.
Oh, you are firmly in that tradition. Just writing, you were in that tradition the moment you set foot in the spaces that you operate in. But this book does something else, and too often the political strategy, the political vision and voice of Black women doesn't get written into existence in these texts. And so we have women doing the work and men taking credit for theory. That can't be the division of labor. And so the book that you did is changing that so much. Your subtitle, Police, Protests, and the Pursuit of Freedom is fascinating to me. And this idea of the pursuit of freedom being bound up in a world without police, for so many people is a new idea. In the book, you talk about it being a new idea for you.
Yes. Yeah.
That you weren't birthed as an abolitionist. You didn't come out of the womb thinking about, in a world without police. You didn't grow up thinking about a world without police. You didn't go through trauma thinking about a world without police. How did you get? Talk to us a little bit about how you went on that journey into thinking about abolition as central to a pursuit of freedom.
Yes, absolutely. It goes back to the first question you asked about which traditions that I was in. So I was learning about this word tradition, and most of the Black spaces I come from, if you Black and you doing something that's positive, then we all are just doing the same thing, right? But I'm rooting for everybody Black. If you're doing something good, then you have the support of a lot of Black people. But as I began to become more mature in my political analyses, I started engaging with this word tradition. And I found that there were a lot of different Black people fighting for lots of different types of freedom, in our world, in our societies, in our families, whatever. And so I wanted to figure out whose traditions that I was in. And just because you are, a Black person doing something good in the world, I guess that good, we just have to interrogate that more, right? Is this leading us towards liberation? Is this leading us towards diversifying oppressive spaces? And so I think part of that journey, or at least what I try to show in the book, is that most of my early ideas, I wasn't committed to reforming the police. I wasn't committing to having the police. I just had a bunch of unexamined politics and a bunch of feelings about the police, right? That took a lot of political education and organizing and being around people who honestly were more critical than I was, who were more radical than I was, who were more curious than I was, who were more patient than I was, and making me think differently about all of these tragic moments that happened. So, when Trayvon Martin was killed by George Zimmerman in 2012, watching the group that became the Dream Defenders, sit in front of the Sanford Police Department, like lock their arms, refuse to move until they were able to put pressure on the police to make an arrest. Right. This is the birth of the Dream Defenders, and to watch them become more curious about the kinds of organization they wanted to be, the kinds of feminists, the kinds of socialists, the kinds of internationalists and abolitionists they wanted to be. I felt lucky to have an evolving set of politics around my peers who were also thinking about what traditions, make them possible too, and what traditions we were also forging. And so going from Trayvon Martin to watching Michael Dunn kill Jordan Davis, after Michael Dunn killed Jordan Davis, Darren Wilson killed Michael Brown, I had attributed a lot of the violence to geography. These things sort of happen in the South. Or what happened to Sean Bell, that's a New York City thing. Or what happened to Oscar Grant, that's a California thing. I'm in St. Louis, I'm in the Midwest, right? This police and vigilante stuff is elsewhere. And then when Michael Brown got killed, down the street from my house, essentially,
Yeah.
All the way for me going to law school is like, wait, this is actually probably much more systemic than I understand. So I'm grateful that I had the curiosity, and I just happened to be in the right place with a lot of people who were pushing me to think differently.
And you say something in the book when you get to that point about Ferguson. You said, I started to understand why we need police abolition rather than reform in Ferguson. Police manage inequality by keeping the dispossessed from the owners, the black from the white, the homeless from the housed, the beggars from the employed. Reforms only make police polite managers of inequality. Abolition makes police and inequality obsolete. The critics of that position will say, even if we concede that point, even if we accept that that is how policing works in the United States, could we not deploy our radical imaginations to use police differently? Couldn't we have police but have them perform a different function in society? What do you say to those people?
Well, it depends. I would want to know more about what other functions, and I would ask that in good faith. I would just be honest. I would say, well, what other functions? Because right now, police, they engage in a lot of different functions in society. You know, if you go to any Black neighborhood, there's like police athletic leagues, and they're playing basketball with like young Black kids. If you go to the border, you know, they're on top of horses whipping Haitian immigrants. If you go to the factories, they're breaking up strikes. So police do like already, they're always deployed to do a vast amount of functions. They're endless. Less than 4% of police calls are for violent offenses. So of the 96% of what else that we're using police to do, what's not already covered? So that I would want some sort of analysis or an assessment of that. The second thing you said here in the United,
No, please. I'm here to listen.
Yeah, I was just curious too about what I do often hear is that, well, we can have police like police in Europe, right? They don't kill that many people a year. You know, they don't engage in racial profiling like we see in the United States. They're nicer, they're more gentle, they have more involvement, more foot patrols. And when you look at the history of policing in Europe, it emerges out of colonial context. And so we can shift from our slave patrol and our labor break context to a European context that still relies on borders, that still makes sure that people who are poor ultimately don't bother the people who have resources and private property. And so we can say, well, we want more colonial policing, but I would have to be very convinced, and I would want to know what else police could do that they're not already doing right now.
That's a fair point. That's a fair point. You say something here that I also found incredibly exciting and interesting. You said abolition, I have learned, is a bigger idea than firing cops and closing prisons. It includes eliminating the reasons people think that they need cops in prisons in the first place. In the book, you take us in a variety of directions to help us understand what those reasons are and how we as a society arrive at those reasons. Even us believing that has a genealogy. Yeah. And you take us there. Why do we believe that police and prisons are so necessary? Before we even get to the how to invest in the other stuff, why do we believe that? How did we get there? And how is it that people who are most harmed by these institutions are often the ones fighting and clinging to it the most? I'm going to give you just one quick example. I was Alpo Martinez, famous drug dealer, New York City, right? Was killed this weekend. And so I went back and I was watching a documentary about him this morning when I was supposed to be writing. I was watching YouTube instead. And it was showing how Harlem had been just decimated by crack. And of course, the police look like heroes.
Yes.
They look like heroes stopping mass killings, people looking like zombies on the street, you know, all sorts of harm being caused. But the other thing that struck me about it was not just that the police would look like heroes, but the people calling for more policing and tougher crimes were the people who were suffering the most.
Right.
How do people who are catching this much hell become convinced that systems that ultimately repress them are valuable to them or are necessary, unavoidable?
Yes. I don't dispute that. Yeah, I don't dispute that. Not at all. I think I don't know if meta narrative is the right, but I think for Black people specifically, especially Black people who are class exploited, there's this bigger umbrella how do I even describe it? Impulse that, look, my ancestors are from this place and I deserve the fruits of this place. I deserve the fruits of America. I deserve to be treated like I'm an equal citizen. I deserve to have the American dream. I deserve to have my own home, my family. I deserve to be able to have
all of it.
Yeah, all of it. So there's this idea that, well, white people get policing, right? That's a part of their citizenship. They get policing, they get equal protection under the law. We want this thing too. So I think part of it, comes from this equality metric of what white people have access to may be inherently good in this society. And so if we want to be safe from violence, then we should get what white people get. And white people get well-resourced policing. So I think that's one part of it. It's like, well, we want equality. And I love when Fannie Lou Hamer says in her autobiography, I don't want to be equal to the white man, because that just means I get to do the power to do horrible things, right? So it's just that. So I think that's part of it. It's just like, oh, y'all get to like own houses. We deserve to own houses. We deserve to be able to buy money from the bank, instead of calling to question private ownership. It's like we've been fighting for this broader inclusion to this project. I think a more specific answer is that, well, Black people have called for police, and as James Foreman writes in his book, Locking Up Our Own, they also have called for lots of other things too. They've called for more investment in education. They've called for better housing, called for the abolition of ghettos. They've called for the elimination of economic exploitation. And one thing that's constantly funded is the police.
Right. They ain't hear nothing else.
Yeah, so even when cops are just like, it's Black people who want us there, it's Black people who want us in our communities, it's like, yeah, well, Black people also poll high with socialism, but I don't see y'all, fighting to make sure that we have a socialist agenda in this country. Right. And so there's like, yeah, when you have your options have all been divested, unfunded, underfunded, and then you tell people that we should divest resources from the one institution that you can guarantee will be constantly funded, it feels like you're removing a default option, right? And the last thing I'll say is that, in addition to that point, actually, so when you take away the one thing that's there, which is a 911 call, it feels like there's nothing. And I think it's on abolitionists to show that your options are not nothing or like anything, right? Your options are no police and lots of other investment in what actually prevents harm and what we can spend time building accountability when harm occurs. And the last thing I'll say is that I think it's a bit more messy than the people who are most oppressed rely on the police, because a lot of people I know who I would consider to be most oppressed, they also say stuff like, free my nigga such and such after he didn't kill 5 people. Right? They say fuck the police, or they say all these other things. Like, what does Nine say? And if I rule the world, he don't say I free all my non-violent offenders. Right. He said I free all my sons. And so we say a lot of different things.
Every cell at Attica send them to Africa.
Every cell. He didn't say some cells. He ain't say cut 50. He more left than Ben Jones. He ain't say none of this stuff, right? And so if we actually pay attention to all of these other robust areas of critique that oppressed people have, it doesn't take away the fact that a lot of people do call the police, but they often call the police because it's a default reaction is already here, already exists, and there's no real other options in a lot of our communities.
That's a great point. So then talk to me about the other slice of that, right? Which is the investment. Your point about abolition, which I think is an important one, and it's a partly about messaging, but it's also a philosophical question and a theoretical question, right? Which is sort of, how do we construct an affirmative vision of abolition, right? Because so much of the time we spend is talking about the world we don't want, right? We don't want police, we don't want prisons, we don't want repression, we don't want violence, but we also have to have an affirmative vision of the world we want to see and what it takes to get us there. And so what I'd like to do is go down a couple of points. I'll start with the most obvious one. And you talk about this in the violence chapter, sex and violence chapter. Whenever you talk abolition, there's always a person who thinks they've thought of something you ain't thought of, right? Like I got her now. I'm gonna ask about, what about serial killers? What about rapists, right? What about, as if this tradition of decades and even centuries of thinking about this we've just never considered this question.
Exactly. Like, you know what? I never thought about what we would do if someone kills someone. That's a
right.
It's like, yes.
But so let's go there though, because it's not enough. Absent a serious answer to that question, then people somehow think that we just want to almost to the if I were the world point, right? Just open up all the prisons, free everybody, fire all the police, and then we just figure it out as we go.
Yeah.
How does an abolitionist vision think about harm and the various forms of harm that are caused by people? Sexual violence being one, murder being another one, and also things like domestic violence, other forms of intimate partner violence, etc. How can we think about this stuff?
Yes. So I don't think we should shy away from those questions. When people ask, what about the murderers? What about the rapists? I get people who ask those questions out of pure antagonism, and it doesn't really matter. If I actually have concrete answers, they don't care what I want to say. But when I'm in St. Louis, or I'm in Baltimore, or I'm in DC, or I'm in New York City, and I'm working in relationship with a community-based organization, and they're asking, what about the murderers? It's because they feel vulnerable to violence, right? And I can't be like, well, that's not a real question, right? So, for example, in St. Louis, we were trying to work on this campaign called Close to Workhouse. So Workhouse is this horrible jail in St. Louis. It's especially horrible, I should say. When I was a kid, I knew so many people that went to the workhouse that I thought it was a place that you would go to get a job. Right? I didn't know it was a jail until people would be gone for like weeks. And I was saying, well, didn't they go to the workhouse? My mom had to explain, like, baby, this is a jail. They're not going there to get work. It's a place that held people captive until they paid off their debts. Wow. So in St. Louis, Action St. Louis, Our City Defenders, Advancement Project, and the local chapter of the Bell Project, they start pushing this campaign to close this jail down. Now, St. Louis has a homicide rate that's among the highest in the country, right? Usually it's on this list of cities with Newark and Chicago and DC. St. Louis also have among the highest per capita rates of police killings, for a city of its size. And so when we were trying to tell people in that community, we want to close down this jail, first question, are we going to be safe? What about the people who do dangerous harms? If we close down the jail, what's going to happen? And so what's incredible about that campaign, not only did they talk about the long-term vision of what St. Louis could be like realistically, they also talked about different ways to get there. And so right now in the intermediate, if you're afraid of violence, right, we understand shootings, especially community-based shootings in Black neighborhoods, come out of preemption. So I'm trying to kill you before you get me, or I'm trying to retaliate. Well, if we need an immediate response, one thing that we can do is rely on street violence interrupters, especially programs that don't have cops, right? Like in Puerto Rico with Talo Salud, right? How do we start investing in immediate violent mediation and interruption actions? And there's people who's been doing that work for years, but it's often unfunded, or if it is funded, it's tied to a policing program. So then you have people who don't want to be a part of the program because they don't want to go to jail. And then when you have it not associated with the police, which is what's happened in St. Louis, you have cops who sabotage the program, who are critical of a street violence interrupting program, right? And so it's like you have to constantly combat the police and make sure that the community where these killings are happening, these shootings are happening, are safe. And so we fought to get street violence interrupting programs, in addition to fighting to close down the jail, in addition to removing funding from the police so they won't continue to sabotage the programs and the resources that can keep our community safe. Like long term, we know that we have to have structural investments in our neighborhoods if we want to reduce community-based violence. That includes jobs, education, housing. What makes people less precarious? Police alternatively make people more precarious. If you have a gun possession, and then you go to jail, now you have a record, now you get out, now you can't get public housing, you can't go to school, you can't get a job, and now you're in a situation where you have to use a gun to protect yourself or to defend yourself from others. And so are we going to continue to invest in systems that make us more precarious and then, more likely to harm someone, either defending ourselves or retaliation, or are we going to, over time, invest and all of these resources that undermine harm? So there's the immediate, then there's like the short term, and then there's the over time, the society that we deserve to live in.
There's an issue embedded in society around patriarchy, around misogyny, around sexism. You take this up, you talk about Me Too, you talk about the movement that undergirds Me Too. How do these systems of misogyny, misogynoir, patriarchy, etc., shape how we should think about abolition? How do they undermine our ability, again, to pursue freedom in the ways that you talk about?
Yeah, well, one clear example is that people ask me, what are we going to do about intimate partner violence? Like the example you just mentioned. Well, if we look at police departments, the rate of domestic violence in those homes where cops live is 2 to 4 times higher than the general public. So this is who we're relying on to rescue the trope of like battered women from their homes, people who are responsible for contributing to household violence themselves, right? And so it's like, well, if we continue to have cops, what we're saying is that we deserve police so that some people can be safe, but the families of police won't be safe, right? That's our option right now. And so the second thing I'll say is that one of the main reasons why people kill each other, and I talk about this in some of the trainings and workshops that I do with community-based organizations, one of the main reasons is because a man is trying to control the sexuality of a woman, right?
Say more. What do you mean by
that? Yeah, so it means that a man and a woman in a relationship, man thinks the woman may be attracted to someone else, she may have slept with someone else, someone may want to sleep with her. He's trying to control her sexual preferences. If she's bisexual, he's trying to discipline her sexuality so she will only be attracted to him. This is one of the highest causes of murder in the United States, right? Like a man deciding the sexual preferences, behaviors, ideas of a woman, right? Second highest cause of homicides, right? And so if we don't work to combat patriarchy, work to combat biphobia, work to combat like the conditioning of men to control other people's bodies, especially women, especially trans women, then what we're doing is setting up men to engage in very violent behavior and then go to prison, which is a site of violence, and then to be subject to sexual violence, either from other people incarcerated or especially from prison staff. And so none of that actually undermines the sexual violence. It perpetuates it, and it shifts someone from their power over someone in a relationship to someone, who is now incarcerated, who's vulnerable to other kinds of sexual violence. So that's something. The number one leading cause of homicides in this country is a fight over a petty offense or argument. And so you said something that insulted my manhood, and now I'm angry, and now you have to die. And that may seem very simplistic, but that's the cause of lots of homicides in the United States.
Yeah.
And so we have to teach men, especially, not only men, but we have to condition people who are trained to be certain kind of men to not act on those behaviors, right? Because they ultimately don't keep us safe. And again, police perpetuate that. We talk about warrior policing and, how cops train and they go through trainings that put them in positions that escalate violence, especially during our context with Black men. It's like, well, police perpetuate that patriarchal violence of control, and they can't be the ones to undermine it. So they can go get the body after someone dies. But do we just want to pay 1 million cops to go be body searchers? Right? Or do we want to undermine the patriarchal violence? Like those are the options that are in front of us.
Those aren't very good options, which is why we push to imagine something different. There's Paulo Freire. I thought about Paulo Freire's work, and he talked about in Pedagogy of the Oppressed and other texts, that the work of freedom is the work of humanization. It's a humanizing project, rather.
Mm-hmm.
He said that the oppressors are dehumanized. It's not only the oppressed who are dehumanized. I can't be fully human as an oppressor. And that resonated with me when I read your chapter on humanization. And you took us on this really interesting political, historical, theoretical tour of thinking about what it means to be human, what it means to be marked as non-human, both in terms of ability status, in terms of these kind of false, almost like kind of Cartesian divides between the spirit or the mind and the body, the spirit and the body. There are all these kind of distinctions you force us to think about and reassess. What does it mean to be dehumanized in the context of a carceral state? What does it mean to be dehumanized? What does it mean? What does the process of humanization look like?
Well, that's a question I posed in the book because I'm actually quite leery of humanization as a way of thinking about policing. And so let me just explain. So I would go to, even still, organizing meetings, and I would hear someone say that the primary problem of policing is that they don't see us as human.
Yep.
They don't see Black people as human beings. They don't treat us as human beings.
They treat us like property, you say.
They treat us like property. They treat us like animals. They don't see us, right? And then it becomes this subjective test of how an individual cop or an institution of police just see Black people. And in response to that, right, it's like, well, if the problem is that police dehumanize Black people because they don't see them as people, then how do we get cops to see us as humans, as people worthy of living lives? And there is a policy that then goes behind that. It's like, well, let's invest resources in policing so they can get to see Black people as human.
Right.
Let's do more community police. If we do more,
I was going to say that becomes the argument for bringing them closer to us.
Yes, exactly. So humanization has then, it has the way it's been used, rather, let me say that, it's being used to pervert the idea of it obscures power. And so now I'm not worried about reducing police, the power of police to hurt you. Instead, I'm investing in the police ability to see you as human. So if y'all do community policing, if we do more training, if we do coffee with a cop, or if we do books and badges programs, or we do policing ice cream trucks, maybe through these encounters, they'll just see you as human. And the police can see you as human as they want to, right? It doesn't undermine their power to be violent against you. And I love the essay that Walter Johnson has in the Boston Review, where he's critiquing this idea that slave owners didn't see slaves as human. He's like, no, they relied on enslaved people's human capacities, their emotions, their ideas, their ability to feel pain and pleasure. And that is what they also exploited in order to maintain slavery. And I think the same is true for police. I don't think it's as simple as police don't see us as human. It's just they have the power to hurt us. And we have to undermine that power for them to hurt us, and all of the potential encounters where that can happen. And so, yeah, I often ask the same question, Mark. I say, what do you mean when is it the way they talk to you? Is it the way they treat you? Is it that they put you in a cage? Like, how do you measure? And then if they have the power to take away your humanity, who has the power to give it back? Right. Like, why do we give police that much power to take that away from us, right? Why? Like, is it when you're no longer pulled over? Are you human again? Like, when does it start? When does it stop? And so I hope that people take from that chapter that we have to focus on power and not just these subjective viewpoints of an officer.
When you entered this abolitionist conversation, it was such an interesting moment, at least when your book enters the conversation. The world has accepted defunding as at least a legitimate debate to have. Even if most people are against it or more people are for it, whatever. It's a part of the conversation that simply wasn't there even when Mike Brown was killed. That wasn't a mainstream conversation. Abolition, not a mainstream conversation. City councils weren't voting on it.
Right. Shout out to Minnesota.
So things are moving fast. I remember when it was announced you were going to write this book, and I remember, when you were writing the book and now the book's out. How has the political landscape shifted from the time you conceived of writing this book till now? And what kind of possibilities or problems did that present for you?
Wow. So I didn't plan on writing this book. I was trying to get a PhD, something that comes up every year for like the last, 15, 20 years. I'm like, I need to go into a PhD program. So I was having one of these conversations with Rob and DG Kelly. He said, I don't think you should go into a PhD program. I think you should write a book. This is in 2016 or 2017. I was like, Robin, what do you mean? I can't write no book. Like, I'm not like, you're Robin. You can just like write a book. I can't just write a book. I need years to think about some of these questions I'm grappling with. And he said, well, Derecka, I think that you have serious offerings to give to this movement that we're in. And this is pre-defund. This is a little after the peak of Black Lives Matter. So I think that you should, write some of these things down. So at that moment, I was very evangelistic. I said, look, we need to make sure that everyone sort of identifies as abolitionists. And so then by the time the uprisings happened, and the book was almost called We Should All Be Abolitionists or something like that. And then by the time the uprising happened, I saw a lot of people, push this defund conversation. So a lot of people start identifying as abolitionists. I was like, wow, this is very, very, very exciting. So the landscape shifted a lot from people saying Black Lives Matter in 2014 to saying defund the police in 2020, just last year. But what's also happening, and maybe which is why the book ultimately came the way that it came, is that I watched people identify as abolitionists almost singularly. It was as if people were engaging with defund and abolitionist politics and not engaging with feminism and capitalism and disability justice. It was just as if you can be an abolitionist alone, right? Yeah. You can abolish the carceral state and not have any analysis or engagement or politics or organizing around all of these structures in which the carceral state is in response to. And so I found myself writing for that earlier time, like that 2016 time, and also trying to be responsive to now that abolition has entered the mainstream. We have all of these incredible texts that are coming out. Ruth Wilson Gilmore has a book coming out called Change Everything. Mariam Kaba had a book come out early this year. We Do This Till We Free Us. Rachel Herzing has a book coming out called How to Abolish Prisons. Angela Davis, Erica Mine, all these people are coming out with texts like, well, okay, what's an offering that I can also give in this particular moment, given that now more people are identifying as abolitionists, at least publicly, and then put them in conversation with all these other paradigms. And I became much more committed that people would join organizations, engage in political education, and develop a robust political analysis rather than just identifying as an abolitionist. Because you can identify as you want. I know Christians who identify as Christians, but you look at their work, you look at their text, you look at their organizer, you're like, maybe you should call yourself something else, sis, right? And so I was hoping that people would be less concerned with identifying as an individual abolitionist and much more interested in like developing sets of politics that are liberatory. Like that's what ultimately matters the most. And I hope that the book pushes people to do that instead.
What is your writing process like?
A mess. It depends. It depends. For my column, I usually write when I'm very angry. Right? I usually write when I'm very angry. I think some of my most powerful sentences, critiques, ideas come from a place of anger and urgency. I think that I thought that would translate to the book, and it did not. Right? It's very different writing 1,000 words in a few days versus writing 100,000 words in several months. And so I had this plan that I would write a chapter a week, every week for 10 weeks. Then I did that. It's like no matter where the last chapter started or ended, the next week is going to be chapter 4. Next week going to be chapter 5. So that was the process. And then everything I wrote really sucked. And I had to discard so much of it. And then I said, okay, Derecka, what is it that you need to do? I was rereading texts that I hadn't read in a while. I was rereading texts that I had just recently read. I need to go out the field. Like I need to read very widely. I was in sociology and criminal. I was just reading really widely. And then I said, okay, what is the story you're trying to tell? And then I started that process again. And I did that over and over again. And the chapters that we have now much more mirror the chapters I was writing in like February than when I started writing the book in October. And so that iterative process happened over and over again of a chapter a week until I could refine the story and then figure out how to pull them together.
And now that you look back on the text now, how do you see your text fitting into that conversation with Mariam Kaba and Angela Davis and Ruth Wilson Gilmore? And I know I'm not asking you to sort of engage in like any kind of arrogance pats on the self-aggrandizement, but in terms of you make a contribution, in terms of the contribution you make, how do you see your book fitting into the contribution? Because it does, and I hope you know it does.
No, I appreciate that. I appreciate that a lot. Well, one is that the style of the book is a little bit different, right? So it has memoir elements, and I think it's because I did not trust my editor initially. She knows this. I say it all the time, but she really encouraged me to talk about parts of that political evolution. And so I tried to do that, right? I think another big difference is that, I still consider myself a baby abolitionist, right? These are policies I've only been grappling with seriously in the last 5 to 7 years, like seriously, maybe 5 to 6 years. And I'm honest about that. And I think what that allows me to do is to be in conversation with a lot of people who are pretty new in that political journey. And so I try to write for people who are sort of abolition curious. I try to be honest and say I'm learning too. And like we're sort of learning together. Ajimone said that in our book talk, like, yeah, you're like doing this with us. And so I see myself in conversations with people who are still asking questions, who are still trying to figure it out. And trying to at least capture in the interviews that I do and the stories that I tell in the book, like, this is my sort of political evolution, but here's other generations, right? Here are other people who are evolving alongside me. This is how that conversation shifted from Black Lives Matter in 2014 to abolish the police in 2021. And so I think that also allows me to like honor so many people. I just get to cheat and like be an inheritor of like all the thinking and organizing they've done. And like it gave me such a good head start. And then to be in conversation with lots of people who are like, I'm new to this. And I'm like, yeah, me too. Kind of like, let's figure this out together. So that's why I think the book does a good job of bringing those traditions and being invited to the people who are also coming in now.
Wow. Well, that's pretty amazing. I think we have time for a couple questions here. I'm looking at some of the questions here that are coming in. One, I think we sort of answered this. Well, let me ask this because Dreadful Dana seems to be asking a slightly different question than what I asked. I would love to hear your thoughts, she said, on abolition with regards to sexual violence, how it's changed over time, if it has.
Yeah, let me see. Have it changed over time? I think similar to my answer about policing, I think I didn't have any strong ideas about, I wasn't strongly committed to any particular response to sexual violence in the beginning. They were mostly unexamined. And because they were unexamined, I defaulted to police and prisons, right? It's like, well, if someone did this thing that's horrible, they should need to go to prison. And then I recalled many instances in my life where I've experienced sexual violence, literally from parties to like relationships. And I was like, why didn't I call the police? Like I never called the police to send someone to jail or expected that to be an outcome. I remember accountability conversations I've had. I was like, well, why weren't police even a factor? Right. So I saw this mismatch in the actual lived experiences of me, my peers, people in our family, where if something happened, we didn't really call the police for that kinds of violence. But if it was someone on TV, like a serial rapist, for example, it's like, oh, where's the police? Go do your job. Right. And so I think what that helped me then, I talk about this too in chapter 6, it's made me realize like, oh, I think that I have actually much more of a commitment to policing and prisons for strangers, right? Because sexual violence from strangers seems more spectacular. It seems more wrong. It's right. Easy to like call the police on this person who's violated you don't know. But then if we look at the data and we talk to people who experience sexual violence, we see that the likelihood of them calling the police to someone who's harmed them, who they live with, who they go to church with, or who they work with, decreases dramatically. And so if police they're not even an option for lots of those encounters. Some people don't want the person to go to jail. Sometimes they just want the harm to stop, right? And so it's like, well, do we want to be committed to undermining and preventing sexual violence and then offering real accountability after it happens? Or do we want to continue to invest in police who perpetuate sexual violence, who can't even respond to all the sexual violence? Because if we really call the police every time sexual violence happens, you know how many people be in prison? Right. You know how many people actually be in prison? If we actually believe that the police would do their jobs and lock everyone, it would be endless amounts of people in prison. And so I was like, well, how do we then become committed to undermining and preventing sexual violence and doing the accountability work, doing the transformative justice work, doing the restorative justice work, when it arises or before it arises, rather than just invest in the system that perpetuates it? So I would say that's from unexamined to examined to like, okay, I have ideas about what I think could happen and what we deserve.
Amazing. Other questions coming in before we go? I think we have time for one or two more.
Thank you for asking.
Kev asked, what did you learn about yourself while writing this book? That's a great question.
It's a great question. So much, honestly, so much. The reasons why I identify as an abolitionist now is very different than the reasons why I identify as an abolitionist before I started writing this book. I think that I had romantic ideas about abolition that had already started like chipping away at over time. So by the time I was writing the book, I just had more space to get them down on paper. I learned that I don't think it's important that everyone identify as an individual abolitionist, but I think it's more important that we build social movements where people are interested and excited about abolitionist ideas and policies and values and relationships, right? And I think that we can do that without feeling we have to convert individual people. I learned that if we don't have the courage and will and commitment to figure a lot of the stuff out now that's in front of us, that we're going to slow down people who are ahead of us. And I don't want to be blamed for that. You know, I don't want to be the ancestor who didn't do my part right now. So I felt the sense of urgency increase over time while writing the book. I learned that writing a book is hard. It's very, very, very hard. And that I just feel, again, incredibly lucky that so many people have been thinking and organizing around this for centuries, like you said, Mark, like before I even put a pen to a sheet of paper. So I feel lucky about that. Hopefully I don't have to write another book in the pandemic. That's something I learned. I did not like that, but yeah. And I'm just lucky to be in conversation with so many incredible people, you know, people who read chapters, people who gave me feedback. People said, I don't know if you want to make that argument. People said, I think you should flesh this one out. I felt very, very lucky. So I learned that I'm like surrounded by all kinds of people who have investments in me and investments in this project, which is really important. Just so much, just so much.
Wow. Bethany G said, I loved reading everything about Belinda Hall in your political education process and how you came to political education more seriously after you were already an activist. Thoughts about when the reverse is true, not getting stalled in the political education stage when you haven't previously been involved in organizing or activism?
Wait, when the reverse is true?
I think the question is sort of, I was trying to think through the question as well. When you haven't done activism or organizing before, what do you say to the person who's never done any of this before and they want to be out in the world doing this work and they don't want to get stalled in the
political education?
Yeah.
Yes. So I think that political education is done best when it's not done alone, when it's done with other people. So hopefully if you are getting or doing political education, it's with other people, hopefully a community-based organization, and you're doing the political education towards something that's liberatory. So towards a campaign, or so that you can build shared analysis about a problem, so then you can figure out how to be responsive to it, right? And so, yeah, I don't think that there's ever going to be enough time for you to learn everything in order to be like the politically educated person down in the world. Like, that's not the goal of political education. As Robin Kelly had to remind me several times, like, you're not just trying to read more to like get it, but political education is something we should be doing throughout our entire lives, right? One thing I found with this book is that I'm grateful. Now I read Black Reconstruction. Now I read it again with the People's Forum in a class. Now I read it again with Dream Defense. I've read this book so many times. And each time I read it with a different organization, I learned something new about the text. Yeah. Right. And so it's like, well, when I learned it to figure out how to build a campaign around defund, it's very different than when I read it by myself. Right. It had different things that were at stake. And then when I took the class, it made me think about abolition democracy differently, right, than when I read it alone. And that helped me write the second half of chapter 4. Because I was like, I don't know if abolition democracy would have played out. Everything would have been good because the United States was committed to all these other horrible genocidal colonial acts, right? And so it's every time I read it was different. But what was important is that when I was reading with other organizers, with other activists on campaigns, it helped shape my analysis, right? And it helped me figure out how to make this thing live. And so I would say that there's no like start and stop point with political education, and then you go like become an activist. Hopefully you're doing both at the same time over time. That's what I still try to do today.
Absolutely. And the beautiful part is now your text will be one of the texts that people
I can't even
It's a fact though, and they will engage and take seriously and learn from in their journey toward political education. And as you said, it's not a destination, right? We spend our lives studying and learning, right? As Robin said, love, study, struggle.
Yes.
And that's what we do constantly. That's how we pursue freedom. And your book is a text that reflects tremendous love. It is a site of study and a reflection of deep study. And through it, we're better empowered to struggle for the world we deserve and the world we're going to get.
Yes.
Because I believe we're going to win. You know we're going to win.
Yes.
Everybody, I can't tell you again how excited I am to even know that this book exists in the world. It's such a special book. Derecka is such a dope sister, such a special person. And I encourage everybody to get a copy of this book. I encourage everybody to not only get a copy of this book, but to share it. And I'm not talking about making money and all this. I don't care about that part of it. I mean that our study groups, our working groups, our organizing groups are stronger when we have texts like this to help us move forward. The book is called Becoming Abolitionists, Police Protests and the Pursuit of Freedom. Becoming Abolitionists, Police Protests and the Pursuit of Freedom. Make sure you grab it. There should be a link there for you to buy it right here from us at Uncle Bobbie's. That's what the book looks like.
You see that cover though?
That cover is fire. Yo, even the cover is dope, yo.
Thank you.
Derecka, thank you so much for hanging out with us at Uncle Bobbie's, and I'm sure we'll build again soon.
Yes, of course. Thank you so much for having me. And thank you everyone who attended.
Absolutely. Peace, y'all.